Hey everyone, I'm Caden. As Martha mentioned, I lead the acquisition net new logo motion for the account-based marketing team over at Snowflake. Um, and really just getting started here. What we've kind of seen over the past year or two is that ABM teams are getting really good at running campaigns and targeting the right accounts. In general, they've just gotten so much better at segmentation, personalization, and really like scaling outreach. But simultaneously, at least what I'm seeing is that they can also still struggle with execution. And I think turning those agentic workflows into actual close one revenue. And one of the reasons for that is something that I think we've all heard about many times before. Marketing and sales still operating in silos, right? And so ultimately, if you don't reconcile those two, again, marketing and sales, you don't just have a misalignment problem, right? In this case, you end up ultimately burning tokens to solve problems that aren't really there according to your sales teams potentially. And so the question that really we've been asking ourselves as we built out our agentic workflows is what does agentic ABM look like if it actually reflects how our sales teams sell and connects marketing data to sales' reality? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to keep going here. This is our ABM innovation framework. And I think when we started thinking about how to do ABM differently in an agentic paradigm, the thing that I'm proud of is we didn't inherently start with like, what do I wish was automated? Instead, I think we really started from a revenue perspective. What are the opportunities that the company is betting on? And what are the biggest challenges that are keeping our execs up at night concurrently? And that led us to think about ABM in a few different layers, from each of which I've brought an example today. At the base, in that bottom left corner, you have automating current work, things that save time and remove manual effort, which is important, of course, and a big advantage of agentic workflows. Top left corner, you have marketing force multipliers, things that help scale campaigns and messaging, also very important, of course. Bottom right corner, you have direct revenue drivers. I think where you're actually like helping shape how sales prioritizes and focuses, something very near and dear to our hearts here at the Snowflake ABM team. And then finally, in the top right corner, you have revenue multipliers, where I think you start to really influence like where to invest and how to allocate resources across a marketing and a go-to-market org. In my view, like most teams are doing a great job in the first two layers off to the left, but a huge opportunity, and the one I would argue largely moves revenue, is really in those two to the right. Because that's no longer where you're just increasing activity. Instead, you're kind of improving how decisions get made across more than just your own marketing org, hence the revenue multiplier effect. So let's get into some examples. Again, if slide 2 is about focusing like sales on data-driven decision making, then this is one of the simplest places where we started applying that. What we tend to see today is a lot of the data that like marketing teams may produce, like it's all very technically useful, right? But I think sometimes it fails to be like usable for sales teams specifically. We have engagement data and campaign performance and intent signals, all coming from the marketing side, like any other account-based marketing team. But an area where there's been a gap in the past, I think, is the fact that all those signals and sort of engagement points still require the rep to interpret all of it and then decide like what is the next step for them. And in practice, I think that interpretation step is kind of where things break down. Like I've been on so many calls with sales reps and sales leaders where the two of them can look at like the same data and just come to completely and like wildly different conclusions. And or more commonly, like they may just not act on the data at all because they don't know like what to do. So I think like when we went to develop sort of weekly or monthly sales insights emails that are sent to our sales teams, instead of asking like, how do we give sales more data? We really asked like a slightly different question, which is just like, how do we make the next step for sales as obvious as possible? And so what we landed on here is something that is pretty simple. Instead of a dashboard, each AE gets like a weekly narrative of what's actually happening in their patch. And more importantly, thanks to the agentic workflow that our team built out here, it's not just one generic report, but instead each AE will get a different story because like each of their patches literally behaves differently and has a different set of context points attached to it. In other words, some might have strong engagement in like a specific set of accounts. Others might have activity concentrated in like a particular persona. Ultimately, the goal here is not to like automate reporting. It's really just to remove ambiguity for reps. And so in that vein, as you can kind of see in the middle right of the screenshot with the bullet points, we're really seeking to give reps like a point of view in natural language in these sales insight emails, so that the data is as actionable as possible and we don't miss out on that closed loop directly attached to revenue with these programs. Just a small example that's being built out, but an important one because again, it's one of the first places you move from generating insight to actually influencing sales behavior. I'm going to keep going here. Right here is kind of where we started focusing on the marketing side with our ABM ad copy curator. I think a lot of the early work around AI and ABM has been focused on generating campaigns, like creating variations and testing messaging and optimizing performance and all of that jazz. And we are doing that here as well. We can generate multiple versions of an ad, run them in parallel, quickly identify which of them performs best. This example, this hypothetical example, is a bit of a cheeky one, but it's representative of something we see all the time on our side, which is you run a few variations and one message clearly outperforms the other. And I think what's interesting there is like usually that middle with just identifying like the top performing ad is where a process will usually stop with regards to a go-to-market team. At best, maybe you scale it across a couple other campaigns and you call that a success. And like, to be fair, that is a success from a marketing perspective. But I think if you go back to the problem we talked about earlier, in a way, it doesn't really solve like the action gap for sales. So instead of keeping that insight within marketing, what we try to do here is translate it into something sales can actually use. In other words, like what narrative should they lead with and what angle should they take in outbound and how should they position themselves? The goal there is just not to test messaging, but to turn that guidance that we're trying to provide into guidance at scale so that sales can actually use it. And Isaac asked a question here. What are you using to build internal tools like the ABM ad copy generator / what we're using now is an internal tool called Coco. And essentially using Coco, if you're a Snowflake customer, you can run something like Anthropic's Cowork or ChatGPT's Codex across your Snowflake data without having to create a direct connection. And it has really, really, really accelerated our ability to vibe code different solutions like the ones we're talking about today. That's a great question. I'm going to keep going here into the more fun stuff. Whoops, here we are. Yeah, so this is the part of the framework we call direct revenue drivers. Going back to earlier, it's that bottom right corner of the slide we talked about earlier. Up to this point, I think we've been talking about things that support execution, like automation and campaigns and messaging. And I would argue this is where ABM starts to really like directly influence pipeline and revenue, because it's about the decisions that determine where sales actually spends their time. So one of the patterns that I see every day is that different sales teams aren't just working different accounts. Instead, they're really like dealing with completely different problems, especially at the leadership level. So in this example, as shown from the prompt on the left side of the screen, like this hypothetical sales segment is getting meetings, but those meetings aren't converting into sales qualified opportunities. And, you know, that's a very different situation than a team that, for instance, is struggling to generate meetings in the first place, right? But a lot of ABM account selection systems or apps will treat those two segments as the same. They'll give you like a static list of target accounts, and the assumption is that the list should work like regardless of what's happening on the ground for those respective sales teams. So the question that we've been asking ourselves as we developed our account selection automation app is, should that output actually be the same every single time? Or should it be more contextual? And so if we look again at the input here, the request is framed around that specific problem. Again, we're getting a lot of meetings, but we're not converting. So instead of optimizing for engagement in that account selection, AKA who will take the first meeting with us, the system shifts towards signals that are more predictive of conversion into an actual opportunity. That means our agent is selecting for accounts where we see stronger alignment to ICP, like stronger buying signals or patterns that correlate with opportunity creation, not just people going to our website, right? And so the output here you see isn't just like a ranked list of active accounts. It's really a prioritized set of accounts that are more likely to turn into opportunities, given that context. And if the problem were different, say getting first meetings or maybe like bottom of funnel conversion, moving things across sales stages, that output would change accordingly. So again, instead of treating account selection as a fixed input, we're really letting it adapt to the problem that sales is trying to solve. Moving on here into our last quadrant, and my favorite, revenue multipliers. Again, it's about leveraging agents to help make decisions that cross-functionally and strategically scale pipeline. And so here's a very quick, like concrete example of what that practice looks like. This is our database coverage app that we vibe coded. As noted by the prompt on the left, what we're looking at here is a way to decide where additional effort and account enrichment resources will actually turn into pipeline. And so on the x-axis with this chart that I have here, on that x-axis, you have database coverage, AKA how complete our contact data is in ABM accounts relative to a benchmark. And on the y-axis, you have pipeline coverage. And so each point is like a hypothetical district. And it's showing us two things at once. It's showing us like, on that x-axis, how prepared are we to engage? And on the y-axis, how much opportunity is already there in a given segment. Now, I think the instinct is usually to look at this and ask like, where are we undercovered? Like, let's just throw resources there. But that's not really the question that we're fully trying to answer here. Really, the question we are trying to answer here is like, where can we optimize for as much revenue as possible? And so if you look at the top right, just for instance, like those districts are already very well covered and the pipeline is strong. And sure, like we could invest there more, but it wouldn't really be creating new revenue. And really, we'd just be adding more activity into something that is already working, right? And then you have areas where coverage is low, the pipeline is already strong, like top left corner. And like these are technically data gaps that in theory might be worth solving, but they're not places where we are going to create like meaningful pipeline, since sales already has their hands full with converting like a full funnel full of opportunities. Meanwhile, I think if you look at bottom left, like these are the areas where we're undercovered and pipeline is relatively low. So like that's not just a gap, that's headroom. In other words, that's where improving coverage can actually create new pipeline that doesn't exist today, and where sales would be like desperate to work the opportunities that we're helping them pipe, frankly. In other words, instead of treating coverage as a data problem, we're treating it as like a cross-functional revenue decision, and where can we focus resources to actually improve like revenue outcomes. And that's really the point of the slide and like our whole database coverage agent. And I'm so glad people in the chat like it. It's not just telling us like where we're missing data, it's telling us where we can create pipeline using agentic workflows, and meanwhile where we can't do it. And so last example, very briefly here, and it's kind of a two-parter in terms of continuing off the last example. Once we know actually where it's worth investing, the next question is who inside the accounts is actually going to matter. Hence that prompt on the left side of the screen. What do we do within our underinvested districts from a persona perspective? And what this view is showing on the right side is our current contact coverage across key persona groups compared to a benchmark. And so each bar represents how many contacts we have for like a given persona in our ABM accounts. And the benchmark shows what that distribution should look like based on high performing segments. And so the gap between the two, like the light blue and the dark blue, is what matters. It tells us where we're under indexed relative to what good coverage would actually look like. And I think the default way to look at this is something like, where are we missing contacts? Let's just buy contacts to fill those gaps. But similar to the last slide, I think from a resource point of view, that's not really the question that we should care about. Instead, I think the question should be rooted in revenue, and it should be which of these gaps actually affects our ability to create pipeline. Because in practice, trying to close every gap across every persona at the same time usually isn't realistic. Not just from a resourcing point of view on like the marketing side, but I think from the sales point of view too. That's a lot to ask sales to absorb from like a focus and an enablement point of view. Ultimately, like we wouldn't want to turn this into a contact dump, in other words, where we add a bunch of new personas and like spend a bunch of money against them and tokens, and they never actually get worked. So instead, we use this framework within our database coverage agent to prioritize. We pick a specific persona group where the gap is meaningful. We focus there first, and we align enablement, messaging, and outreach around that group. In other words, instead of trying to fill every gap evenly, we prioritize based on the sizes and the significance of the gap. Larger gaps and higher impact personas would get addressed first after sales buy-in, because that is where coverage is most likely to change the outcome on the previous slide in our matrix, and thus increase revenue. Closing out here, and just to sum things up, I think what we've seen with agentic ABM workflows is that it's a lot easier to generate like more marketing and more output, but it really requires cross-functional conversations and big picture alignment to exec level revenue priorities to turn those agentic inputs into actual revenue and be part of that 7%.